Hello, everyone, and welcome to another special edition of Brussels Sprouts Live. We're so excited to be recording in front of a live, albeit online live audience today. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor.
And I'm Jim Townsend.
And we're so glad you can join us. The world is undergoing seemingly seismic shifts. After a long period of confrontation with Russia and an especially intense 3 years of concerted effort to isolate and punish Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, the Trump administration is seeking to normalize relations. U.S. support for Ukraine, too, is being recalibrated. The Trump administration is openly criticizing President Zelensky, attempting to extract its minerals and making major concessions before negotiations even begin, crippling Kyiv's standing in a future negotiation to end the war. And after its long commitment, decades-long commitment to Europe and its security, the Trump administration has signaled that Washington will no longer be primarily focused on European security, and there are open questions about whether the U.S. will withdraw troops from all countries that joined NATO after 1990 and even Kosovo. There's so much we have to put on the table for today's discussion, and we're very happy to be joined by two excellent experts, Emma Ashford and Stephen Wertheim, to discuss and maybe debate the ongoing shifts in transatlantic affairs. So welcome to you both, Emma, Stephen. It's so great to have you.
Glad to be here. A longtime listener, first-time caller.
Awesome. Love it. Okay, very quick intros. Emma Ashford is a senior fellow with the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program at the Stimson Center, and Stephen Wertheim is a senior fellow with the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Before we get started, I want to let the live audience know that we will be soliciting questions from listeners through this recording, and so we encourage anyone that has a question they'd like to ask to do it. But to do that, you go on to CNAS.org/live, and you can scroll down to the chat box. So I'm really eager to weave those questions into our discussion today. Let's just start with a really big, broad question, and love to get both of your views. Emma, maybe starting with you, of just how you would characterize what has played out and transpired over this last week, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly been an exciting week or two for those of us that follow transatlantic relations, a bit like drinking from a fire hose. I mean, look, I guess I would characterize it very simply. The US has been trying to get Europe to do more on defense for a very long time, and it's been doing a good cop routine on that, right? Work with us, do more, we'll help you. Trump has come in and he has clearly decided to try the bad cop routine. And I think he has gone further than anybody might have imagined in that sense. But I don't think any of this should have come as a surprise. This is, I think, the logical continuation of, several decades of US policymakers saying Europe needs to do more on defense, of at least a year and a half of particularly Republicans saying, that we need to pull back from Ukraine. So, for me, the thing that was surprising wasn't even really as much the way the Trump administration approached this as just how much of a shock it appeared to be to folks in European capitals.
Great. I mean, I think this issue of should we be surprised or not surprised is a really interesting one. I actually keep thinking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it was quite clearly telegraphed, and yet many people didn't want to believe that it would happen, and people would make the rational argument, oh, well, it doesn't make sense. And even though the U.S. warned, people were still shocked that it happened. And so, Stephen, really same question to you, but is there anything that you have found surprising?
A lot of the particulars are surprising, for sure. I wouldn't have necessarily predicted the tenor of the Vance speech, Secretary of Defense Hegseth's specific remarks, given when they were. But it shouldn't be surprising to see President Trump say all kinds of different things and get into now a shouting match with Zelensky. But yeah, I think I agree with Emma that basically the big picture is not that surprising. We have a kind of announcement by the Trump administration that it wants to renegotiate the transatlantic relationship. That's what I think it all amounts to. And specifically that it wants to move quickly and as decisively as it can to try to bring about a rapid end to the war in Ukraine. But, I think nothing is set in stone about what exactly this administration's approach will be. We also saw a lot of different noises from members of the administration at different points in time over the past few weeks, including some partial walkbacks of statements that had been made. So I think that's where we are right now. And there's a tendency to do two different things when reacting to President Trump and the Trump administration. And I think, these tendencies should generally be resisted. One is to wish cast or to sane wash and try to take what we see from the administration and put the best possible spin on it, make it seem as coherent as possible. The other tendency is to worst case, to dismissively worst case, and say that the realization of all our fears is now coming to pass because of the latest Trump statement. The truth is probably in between those two tendencies.
I guess one thing, so I agree that Trump telegraphed and was very clear that Europe would not be a priority, that the allies need to do more for their own security and defense. He was very clear about wanting to bring an end to the war. But I guess what has surprised me is how he's gone about trying to bring an end to the war and the pace and the extent to which he seems to be totally falling in with the Russians. And the whole meeting in Saudi Arabia, I actually found quite surprising. And I wonder if you both want to comment on that, Emma, first.
Yeah, so I think the speed with which the meeting in Saudi Arabia happened, I think, was surprising to me as well. I had assumed that we'd be several weeks out before any conversation actually happened. But, I think it's interesting. They mostly didn't talk that much about Ukraine, other than talking about a desire to get to a settlement. Instead, what they talked about were things like bringing the embassies back up to staff. So, setting some of the groundwork for US-Russia dialogue. And I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing in this context. Look, I think the administration has been very clear that they want to move towards a settlement here. They have always said, again, very, very similar things, right? That a realistic assessment of battlefield realities suggests some kind of settlement is needed. They've been pretty consistent in the line all the way back into the campaign about territory needing to be traded, or at least, if not acknowledged as lost to Russia, then at least, some sort of de facto status quo has to be put in place. And they've said that, European states will have to step up and pay more. So all of that, I think, again, very consistent. The fact that it's not necessarily unpopular in Moscow, I don't think it's that they're echoing Russian talking points, at least on that point. I think it's much more that this is what the administration's been aiming for a while. I think the one area which we might want to talk about a little more is this sort of Trump-Zelensky spat that has come out of things, because it seems like the Ukrainians have pushed back very aggressively against the Trump administration, and very understandably, I would think. But that does not appear to be a wise approach from the point of view of Kiev, because I think now Trump is in many ways doubling down on saying, well, we don't have to listen to you at all. And he's playing a very strong hand. So for Kiev, for Zelensky, I suspect this is probably a losing approach.
Really quickly, I definitely want to get to Trump Zelensky, but set that aside. And I want to stay on the Russia-US piece just for a second longer. Do you think it was, what is the point of meeting with the Russian side if they're not discussing Ukraine? Don't you think, traditionally statecraft would have been that you would have hammered out some sort of position, or at least had conversations with the Ukrainians and the Europeans first, so that you're going into the meeting with the Russians from a more kind of unified position? Obviously, they made all sorts of crazy concessions before they even stepped in the room. I guess I don't understand the point of meeting with the Russians the way they did. And I wonder how you see that, and whether you think that was the right thing to do.
Look, I mean, I think we all know the Trump administration is a little more loosey-goosey about how it does these things than most other administrations, right? They're not a fan of the interagency process. So, we were never going to get something that was, meticulously choreographed beforehand. But, I think there is something in what they are saying, that it is time to sit down and see what the Russians are willing to put on the table and have that conversation. And again, I think it's notable, right? They didn't iron out some concrete, coherent position with Europe, with Ukraine beforehand. And I think the argument that would have been hard to do actually does carry some weight here. But even as these talks with the Russians were happening with Secretary Rubio in Riyadh, right? Keith Kellogg, the envoy for Ukraine, he was in Kiev today, yesterday. He's been in a variety of European capitals. He stayed at the Munich Security Conference. He's been doing the rounds of talking to the Europeans. So, again, I think there's a possibility here that this is a division of labor and that they're pursuing both tracks.
Yeah, can I make a point on that? So I think in this administration, there is an immense amount of frustration with the Europeans. I think there are many people, and this is unlike the first Trump term, when Trump himself may have been frustrated with the Europeans, but a lot of his staff had a different view. This administration has lots of people who think that Europe needs to be shocked into finally doing what they think the United States has trying to get Europe to do for a long time. They also, I think, have been getting some messages from Europeans to try to slow down the process of reaching a settlement over Ukraine. And so one way to say no in a decisive manner to those requests is to start the process bilaterally with Russia, which we also shouldn't ignore, as Emma said, the meetings that are happening with Ukraine. I also think what's confused people is that there may be a different calculus in this administration about the kinds of pressure and inducements that need to be applied to Moscow and Kyiv to bring about a settlement. This administration, rightly or wrongly, seems to think that given Russia's upper hand on the battlefield, it needs to signal that it is serious about reaching some kind of accommodation, and that Moscow could actually, if it engages in a real negotiation, not just one for show, could actually get what it needs in a negotiation. That would make some sense of Secretary Hegseth's so-called concessions, saying that it's unrealistic for Ukraine to take all its territory back since 2014, unrealistic for Ukraine to join NATO, at least as a part of a settlement of the war. And at the same time, I think there's a view that Ukraine, rather than needing persuasion, needs tough love would be too euphemistic, right? It needs real pressure. It needs to know this is a different United States, a different administration, and that even things like taking NATO off the table could ultimately help Ukrainian leadership to come back from a settlement and explain why the prize of NATO membership had not been achieved. So there may be some of that thinking in the administration. At the same time, there's clearly a lot of Trumpian noise and grievances, sometimes backed by claims that are simply not factual. So we have to try to sift through those different things.
That's all very interesting, and thanks for your interventions, and thanks for appearing on our show as well. I look on that meeting in Saudi Arabia as a sign that they're trying to enlarge these talks. They don't want to focus just on Ukraine. It's a negotiating tactic to, depending on the kind of hand you hold, a strong one or not, is to try to put more things on the table to expand the discussion and bring in other things to use as trade bait or whatever it might be. And so it seems to me, particularly after the phone calls between Putin and Trump, that they have put some big things on the table now, much bigger than Ukraine. You mentioned earlier Trump talking about redoing the U.S.-European transatlantic relationship in terms of security. Well, that's what Putin wants to do too. And there seems to be a lot of heat and light coming from talking about all the great things that can come from U.S.-Russian cooperation in terms of business and rare earths and this and that, all this excitement. Let's get our embassies going again. Let's get working groups. We'll get these teams, they said, going to work on these things. And it sounds like Ukraine is just one of a number of things that they're going to be talking about. And a lot of what is decided between about Ukraine is going to be based on what the Russians and what the Americans agree on in a larger context. There might be trade-offs between what Putin wants Europe-wide versus what he might do in terms of trading something dealing just with Ukraine. So I think this is becoming three-dimensional chess with a lot of things at stake. And one of the big things is how quickly the isolation that the U.S. and the West put Russia into, that isolation has disappeared, except for maybe the Europeans who are left in the lurch and trying to figure out, so what do we do now? If the U.S. is now going full bore and talking about all these things over our heads, again, more than just Ukraine, what do we do now? And so just my point to both of you two is any commentary on that, about the bigger game going on, the U.S.-Russian relationship, which is in such a different place. You know, NATO just put out, or they're getting ready to put out, the NATO strategy on Russia. Well, they're going to have to redo it because it's OBE now. So just your view on this, the bigger negotiation, the bigger things at stake between the U.S. and Russia, and how that's going to play in terms of where Ukraine goes.
I guess, like, just to add on your question just a teeny bit, what's on the table for the U.S. other than economic deals? I mean, we're offering all sorts of things, rolling back NATO forces, no U.S. troops, no U.S. backstop, bringing in non-European troops to keep, I mean, I haven't heard of what is in the U.S. national interest. What benefit do you see coming and accruing to the United States from this larger discussion?
Yeah, we've heard nothing from Moscow in terms of a concession, some sweetener they might throw in the pot,
except economic deals, right?
They're waving dollars in front of Trump, and he's going for it. But what do you guys think?
So I might reframe that a little differently, perhaps. I think, yes, more things are on the table. I think the Trump administration is actually signaling that pretty clearly, that they are open to discussing things like transatlantic relations, European security architecture, NATO membership, things like that. And I think it's notable that these are things that have been either not on the table in prior discussions, like some of the US-Russia discussions immediately prior to the start of the war, that failed. And these were things that actually did come onto the table in some of the failed attempts to resolve the war during it, right? If you go back to the Istanbul talks in May 2022, the Ukrainians and the Russians, without the US and the Europeans in the room, are talking about some of these issues, right? About NATO membership, about neutrality, about arms limitations. So I don't think it's at all unreasonable to put these things on the table. And to my mind, what the administration, again, right, Trumpian messaging is all over the place. I really don't even know what's happening with the rare earths stuff. But in a broader context, I mean, look, I think putting things like conventional arms control in Europe on some potential future strategic negotiating table with the Russians, saying to them that we are willing to talk about things like US troop deployments, things the Trump administration has already said they want to pull at least some US forces back out of Europe. To me, that seems like a way to incentivize the Russians to come to the table. And then we try and think through, how to resolve this conflict and prevent it restarting in the future. And those will be much, much tougher issues. And to me, again, right, this seems like a less like we're giving away the shop to Moscow and more like a little bit of a reversion to reality, right? We're not ending Russian isolation. We're understanding or acknowledging the reality that actually Russia was really only isolated from the US and Europe, by sanctions and had pretty much free hand elsewhere in the world. We're acknowledging the reality that Ukraine has been at the center of US-Russia policy for the last 3 years, and that there are other issues, right? Everything from nuclear weapons on down that we really should be talking to the Russians about the same way we should be talking to the Chinese about them and other great powers. So, I mean, again, for me, I don't see these as concessions. I see these as reopening the diplomatic toolbox in a way that it's just been shut for the last 3 years.
Is there anything on offer from the Russian side? I mean, what is it? I mean, you know, the Rubio and others have said there have to be concessions by all sides. And then 9 hours after the talk, Moscow's launching another drone strike at Kyiv. They're making announcements that Russia's not making any territorial concessions. They're basically now ruling out any NATO member state from putting troops in Ukraine as part of any peacekeeping deal. So we're putting things on the table. The Russians are taking things off the table. And so that I guess that's what I don't understand.
They're putting things not just off the table, but in their pocket.
Yeah, I mean, if you freeze history at this moment in time, then it doesn't look great, right? On the other hand, we are getting into a negotiation in a position on the battlefield that is not favorable. So I think it shouldn't look great at this point in time. Presumably what Secretary Rubio is referring to is, among other things, an agreement to stop the war. And, you know, that would be a big quote unquote concession from the Russian side. And so I think, you know, we again, none of this feels good. I had a little bit of surgery on Friday and underwent general anesthesia. And my goodness, that was a tremendous timing. I recommend it to all. But I do think we don't want to be sort of premature and extrapolate the kind of trends of the last few weeks to a final outcome. The other thing I'd say is, you know, one thing I think is important to keep in mind is how this administration may make decisions. What many people view as concessions, it may not view as concessions. So I think this administration thinks it would be against US interests to admit Ukraine into NATO. And I happen to agree with that view. Putting aside the dynamics of any kind of negotiation with the Russians, it would just be bad for the United States. So, you know, is it a concession to say that it's unrealistic for Ukraine to join NATO as part of the settlement? I think you could say fairly that it is a concession, right? Because it's something that the Russians don't want, but, you know, it takes a different character as well if you think that action, keeping Ukraine from joining NATO, would in fact be good for the United States, and that Ukraine joining NATO would be bad for the United States. And so I've kind of felt that, you know, we're most likely to see, whether as a result of a US-Russia bargaining process or as a result of unilateral measures, are things that the Trump administration may want to do anyway because of its view of what's in America's interests, that also coincide with what Russia may like to see. And that's why I've thought for a while that we are likely to see, you know, US troop reductions, at least from parts of Eastern Europe.
Can I just throw a few extra things onto the pile here? Because I think, you know, I think Stephen's first point is very much correct, right? We are negotiating from a position of weakness at this point. And that is just the fact. If we had started negotiations 18 months ago, when Ukraine was in a much stronger position, you know, then we would be talking much more, I think, about Russian concessions. Now it's about ending or freezing the conflict. And from this administration's point of view, the way they conceptualize US interests, that is a significant strategic win, right? They want to be able to pull back troops, but particularly pull back systems, stop sending weapons to Ukraine, focus more on the Indo-Pacific. So, you know, for them, these things are strategic wins. And I think we also should be very careful about not just framing this in terms of NATO membership or ending the war, right? There's going to be a lot of down into nitty-gritty details about things that aren't just territory or NATO membership, right? And then the Russians are going to make concessions. They're going to make concessions on things like, Ukraine is going to have to be armed, right, as a part of the settlement. The Russians have said before they don't want that. Well, I don't think that would be acceptable. There would be no settlement. So they are going to make concessions. But at these big picture things, many of which we actually understand were kind of already off the table in a practical sense, I don't think we're going to see movement on those.
Jim, I know you have a question, but a quick follow-up. Emma, don't you think there's things that the Trump administration could have done to be in a stronger position going into negotiations? So like, what if, and I get that, I understand the priority is on the Indo-Pacific, but what if they had announced that there would be a new aid package? What if they had really put the push on Saudi Arabia to produce more oil to lower oil prices and the Europeans bring down the oil price cap? What if they got really serious about secondary sanctions or other things? What if don't you, and to me, it seems like the Trump administration coming in, maybe there was a hope that from the Russian side that they could deal. And so if Trump had come in and said, guess what, we're passing a new round of military aid, a new supplemental package, I think that would have had Putin's head spinning, saying, wow, I really can't sustain this forever. And by the way, I am also having manpower issues. My economy, maybe I can write it out this year, but I don't know if I can write it out beyond. To me, there seemed like a better way. And there was a short period in time where I thought that was the direction that we were headed in, with, Trump saying we can do this the easy way or the hard way. And, boy, Putin's country has been driven into a ground. And now it's like we did we took a sharp turn from that trajectory. I mean, that's what's also been head spinning to me. I thought we were marching down a slightly more productive path where Trump was going to look for opportunities to increase U.S. leverage so that we didn't have to go into a negotiation from a position of weakness. But they have seemed unwilling to do that.
I mean, look, I think the main problem with that approach, I think, was timeline and constraints, right? So announcing a new aid package, great. But we know at this point, the Pentagon is very concerned about just physical constraints on what can be sent and what it's costing in readiness elsewhere, right? So they were always going to push back against that in any administration. And then the timeline problem, right? I mean, the economic restrictions you talk about, well, we've been saying for 3 years that the Russian economy is going to collapse. Actually, honestly, we've been saying it since 2014 and before that since 2008, and it doesn't, right? So, yes, things are not great on the Russian side. I think that's part of why they're talking now, and that's good. But I don't think there's anything this administration could have done that would have fundamentally altered the situation on the battlefield, right? That Ukraine doesn't have enough men, that the Russians continue to make grinding gains, and that there's not really military equipment or money that we can send that will fix that problem in the short term. And so, the Biden administration, I think, got themselves very wound around, they got stuck in this position. They had to wait till Ukraine got to a better place in order to negotiate, and then Ukraine never did, and it got worse. And so, I think logically, I totally buy that argument. Practically, it didn't work, and I just don't think it would have worked this time either.
Steve, did you want to add anything to that?
I think I agree with both Andrea and Emma. I mean, I think I would have been supportive of the kinds of measures that Andrea mentioned. Maybe that could have helped, but I also think Emma's right that at the end of the day, they would not have fundamentally changed the question of, who has more leverage on the battlefield, is time on Russia's side or Ukraine's side. And I also don't think that even though there's been a pivot toward a different approach, that we won't pivot back necessarily to putting more pressure on the Russians, to trying to lower the price of oil, et cetera. It may be that the Trump administration is keeping some of its options in reserve for when negotiations actually get going and there's something to actually pressure Russia into supporting.
Well, I'll throw something even more different on top of you guys, and that is, I don't think Trump thinks about anything that we've been talking about for the past 10 minutes. I don't think he's thinking about timing and this little thing and that and reconstruction and who's going to. I think his whole perspective is, I'm going to call Putin. We're going to get our relationship back on track. We're going to get U.S. companies back into Russia. I'm going to be walking around with a tough guy, like I like to walk around with tough guys. I'm going to look great because he and I are going to quickly agree to a ceasefire. That's easy. We're going to agree to a ceasefire, and I'm going to walk away from that, and I'm going to tell the Europeans, okay, you deal with the details. I got you the ceasefire. Over to you. I'm going back to more important things here in the U.S., and I'm going to make sure our companies get into Russia and into Ukraine so we can get back some of that money that we've been sending to Ukraine in terms of rare earths and blah, blah, blah. I think he is at the 30,000-foot level. He's going to deal directly with his friend Putin, and he's going to get stuff that's important to him and leave the details to Europe to sort out. What do you think about that?
Could be. I mean, that concerns me. I think that's plausible. And then you add to that Trump, walking away and saying, Europeans, if you care, you take care of it. And if you can't take care of the problem, it's your fault.
Right.
So, yeah, I think that is a possible outcome that concerns me. But I don't think it's an inevitable outcome based on what we know at this point in time. I think it is a positive thing that the U.S.-Russia meeting that occurred in Riyadh did not immediately lead to Trump-Putin talks, and instead talked about setting up a number of working level groups.
Right.
So in other words, it's not just about what Trump has in his mind. Trump had things in his mind in his first term with respect to Kim Jong-un, and that did not come to pass precisely because there was not enough diplomatic spade work and not a realistic set of proposals that were developed. So, I would just bear that in mind, even as I do share your concern.
Emma, you can answer that too, but just let me layer on one more thing. So this is okay, well, what are the drivers of US policy here? So we've had the constraints argument. Now we've just had the personal leader to leader who's, do you want to be with the strong man or the victim in Ukraine? But the other, I think, theory that's percolating out there is the reverse Kissinger, that we're concerned about China and would like to employ Russia in order to push back. Do you think that has anything to do with this?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, I think Jim is absolutely right about the president himself. I think you forgot that he wants the Nobel Prize.
Right. So, I always, yeah.
So he wants a big, beautiful deal, and he wants to walk away from it and be a peacemaker. But, I think the one good thing that we can say is that there are people around him, there are people in the administration who, have an interest in making sure this is not a fiasco, right? This is, I think, not like last time where many of Trump's advisors are not aligned with him on the issues. And I think genuinely, as Stephen said, what we saw coming out of Riyadh was, something that looked like a fairly realistic set of next steps. It wasn't an immediate summit. And so even if Trump doesn't think about these things, I suspect that his staff at least will not let him or will not push him towards that sort of very superficial deal that will collapse in a few months. So, from my point of view, I think we're still in that space. On the reverse Kissinger, look, we hear this all the time in DC. I actually remember right after the initial Russian invasion of Ukraine, being at a meeting and a bunch of DC folks were really excited because now we can peel China away from Russia. And so, this Kissinger just occupies the central position in everyone's thinking in DC. I think my read of where this administration is coming down on this is not that they intend to do some grand bargain that pulls the Russians away from Beijing. That is probably not possible. I do think there's something to the idea that they want to move away from the Biden administration's, if you'll forgive me, Andrea, axis of authoritarians idea.
Axis of upheaval, Emma. Axis of upheaval.
We've changed it. Okay. But the idea, right, that China, Russia, North Korea, etc., are all this unified force. And I do think, the notion is that you could perhaps have a more flexible approach to the world where you don't push other states to align more closely with each other. So, again, that would be a whole different podcast to debate it. But I think the truth is much closer to that kind of approach than it is to we're going to do a grand bargain.
Or do you think that it's just that Trump adheres to spheres of influence and he's perfectly willing to kind of give Russia his sphere of influence, maybe willing to concede that, and then we're going to focus on our hemisphere?
I think that's actually very true. I mean, we saw in his inaugural address, he came right out of the gate talking about, I don't think he actually said Monroe Doctrine, but he referenced McKinley, he referenced Manifest Destiny, right? So this is where his mind is. And so, there's a clear push to make sure that China is not in our hemisphere. And so, yeah, I do think this notion is one that carries some credibility among the Trump folks in the administration. I actually tend to agree that there is something to that notion, right? That the idea being, that we have, pushed right up to the boundaries of Russia and China in the post-Cold War period. And that has led to a number of the frictions that we see with both of these states today. And we need to find some way to diffuse that tension. Now, I don't want that to be, and I don't think that should be, Russia marching into Kiev and installing a puppet government, right? Which is why I've backed arms for Ukraine from the start of this conflict. But I do think we have to be realistic, right? That there are places like Ukraine, like Taiwan, where maybe forcing that choice, choose the US, choose Russia, choose China, that's not going to be a feasible approach to some of these countries. So I don't think he's necessarily wrong on that point.
The hard thing will be, I think, that will give a lot of our European listeners extreme heartburn, because it's how far does that sphere extend? And if we are talking about removing sanctions so they have the capacity to rebuild militarily, and we're talking about rolling back US forces to the 1990 line or 90, I don't pick your line, that conceivably would give Putin the opportunity, the time, and the space for aggression against other European countries. And I guess, so Jim, you chime in here too, if you're sticking on my point.
Well, actually, go ahead and answer Andrea's, because it's a very important point. And Steve, you've got something to say too. And then I have something to say that's going to blow up the axis of upheaval.
Okay, I don't know if we can do that, but
that'd be a good thing.
Yeah, no. Okay, but real. So I guess this idea of spheres of influence, I mean, what is the cost for US prosperity and security? By basically signaling, and by the way, we're cutting our defense budget, we're rolling back troops, we're potentially removing sanctions on Russia. What are the signals? How do you read Russia, and do you think it creates conditions for an expansion of Russian aggression in other parts of Europe beyond Ukraine?
Yeah, so I mean, I share this concern. I think there is a pronounced spheres of influence view that we're seeing in Trump 2 that we haven't seen so clearly before. I also think it was unfortunate from my point of view. Look, I and Emma as well, we have advocated a responsible and gradual transition to European leadership of European defense, right?
Right.
I thought Hegseth's remarks were defensible. I thought Vice President Vance's speech was really unfortunate, because, not leaving aside some of the issues with promoting right-wing populist forces in Europe for a moment, it seems that he wants a weaker Europe, a more divided Europe, and is trying to boost the very forces in Europe that want to do less to make Europe capable as a defense actor. So I think there are mixed messages coming from the administration, and maybe just different views on what kind of Europe they want to see. So I'm concerned about how, a sudden transition, how that might provide a window of opportunity for Russia. At the same time, and obviously this president has a thing for strongmen, especially Vladimir Putin, right? That is hard to wrap one's head around. At the same time, I think it's still very unlikely that we're going to see the United States return to, 1990 NATO lines in terms of its conventional force posture in Europe in the next 4 years. It's at least by no means clear that that is what anybody in the Trump administration has in mind. I don't think it would be feasible, even if that's where some of them want to go. So we may get a much more modest approach coming out of this, in which case I think the benefits that Emma pointed to become real. The benefits of not being so close to Russian forces in Ukraine or elsewhere. The benefits of Europe being a more responsible actor that should carry more of the load for its defense. And I could say the same thing about Taiwan. So there's a certain degree to which some spheres of influence thinking could get us to a better place and reduce the risk of major power conflict, so long as it isn't as drastic and abrupt in terms of causing a change as one might fear.
I probably don't agree with what you said, but I do think the phasing, the sequencing, I mean, it's an argument that Mike and I made in our last Foreign Affairs. Well, the prioritization is very important, so is the sequencing. And so
yes.
On that point, I agree with you very much. Jim.
Thank you very much. That's fascinating to talk about spheres of influence in that way. And I agree with Andrea. I don't think I necessarily agree with you, but I think it's a very interesting concept. I mean, we've gone through how many courses in international relations talking about the evils of the spheres of influence, and now we're talking about, well, maybe there'd be some positives. So I think it's really something that is very interesting. But I want to go back to the reverse Kissinger just for a second. First of all, and most importantly, we've got to come up with another term than reverse Kissinger. I think of Kissinger doing a backflip, and something thing, and that's he's done the reverse. He spiked that reverse Kissinger. It's 100%. So let's do work on that. But on the axis of upheaval, which I agree with, and Andrea has been very great in pushing that, Andrea. I'm wondering if we're seeing a change in that. Whereas I can see you laughing, Andrea, but I'm not undercutting the theory here.
Our life's work is going down the drain. No.
But, a year ago, there was this so-called axis. I mean, people debate the word axis, but the Russians needed help from the North Koreans. They needed ammunition. They got infantry as well. They needed Iran because they had the drones that came out of Iran were very useful at that time. And of course, the Russians needed China desperately for all kinds of reasons, all that we know. So there were these four capitals that were working together primarily to help out Russia. Now, to my mind, that axis of upheaval is beginning to kind of break up, because if Putin has stars in his eyes for normalizing relations with the United States, that there is going to be some things for Putin that are going to be great coming out of this, sanctions lifted, et cetera, you would think that if peace comes to Ukraine, and as the Russian defense industry continues to surge and produce things, suddenly Russia doesn't need China as much. Suddenly Russia doesn't need North Korea. They don't need the ammo from North Korea. The infantry hasn't turned out to be doing such a great job anyway. And then you have Iran, which is laying helpless in the Middle East under the boot of Israel, frankly. And so they're not going to be so much help for Russia either. So that axis that came together a year or so ago to help Russia and to work together, to somewhat work together, that suddenly is going to be loosened because of the Russian-U.S. rapprochement and the potential ending of warfare under some circumstances with Ukraine. So has that axis now actually become a China, Russia, U.S. axis of upheaval? Is that not a better term? Andrea, what do you think?
I'm not jumping on that. Oh, Emma, Stephen, I don't know if you want to touch that one.
I just think Jim is making a very powerful argument about the strategic benefits for the United States in bringing about the end to the war in Ukraine. It's not the only consideration that we have, but a lot of the coordination and cooperation among the so-called Axis members has been effectuated and accelerated by the war and by Russia's profound needs to be able to keep its war machine going. And I think that's the way we should be thinking about this problem, as opposed to the reverse Kissinger or an attempt to, join a new axis with Russia. I mean, I don't favor that, first of all. I don't think it's realistic. And Kissinger himself didn't, he came in after the Sino-Soviet split. He didn't effectuate a, massive shift in Beijing's relationship to the Soviet Union. He exploited a fissure that already existed. So I think we should think about enlarging the space for the pre-existing conflicts of interest among the four countries,
Right.
Not about this kind of grand chess game that's very unlikely to bear any fruit.
Emma, you can jump in really quickly. I do want to have the last at least 10 minutes to get back to Ukraine really quickly.
And audience questions too.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, let me, I guess, sort of try to start as moving in that direction. Because, I think what Stephen's saying is right. And flexibility is the key. And that goes for not just for, perhaps not conceptualizing this as some unbreakable axis, right? There are differences between these states. We can exploit that. But I think flexibility is also needed on the transatlantic side, on the US and its allies side. You asked, Andrea, should, what we're talking about here be causing heartburn in capitals in Eastern Europe and the Baltic? Probably, honestly. It should have been for quite some time, honestly. And, I think the real problem is right now we're looking at a new era, and we're still dealing with the realities of the old unipolar moment. And, if I could just put it bluntly, right, NATO expansion was a Ponzi scheme. Right? The United States committed to defend states in Eastern Europe in which it didn't really have any strong interest in doing so, other than that they were part of this Euro-Atlantic system, right? The reason that the US would step in and defend the Baltics is not because they're an important trade partner or military power. It's because not defending them would collapse Article 5 and collapse the whole of NATO, right? And so the countries come in, and that defense commitment doesn't get called into question, and it holds. But I do think there is something very worrying about that. And one of the concerns, I've said this before, one of the concerns I have about putting Ukraine in NATO when we haven't stepped up to defend it in the last 3 years, I think rightly, is that would then undermine the credibility of Article 5 for anyone else. To my mind, the solution to all of this is shifting towards more European-led defense of Europe, right? The credibility of states in Europe to work together, right? Poland with the Baltics, or, the European Union working together on different things, on funding. The credibility of that is much greater than a US extended deterrent is. And so again, I think that there is progress here. And I think, even ending the war in Ukraine could be one way to start talking about some of these bigger issues, which is clearly where the Trump administration wants to go.
Ending the war in Ukraine is where I want to go. Thank you, Emma. Doesn't Trump need Zelensky to end the war in Ukraine? I guess so this gets back to where you put on the table earlier, Emma, with the Trump-Zelensky relationship, and that seems to have deteriorated very rapidly. You said, Emma, it was a mistake for Zelensky, which in some ways I agree with, but is it also a miscalculation on Trump's part? Because what you do see, I think, are more Ukrainians kind of rallying around Zelensky, pushing back against this idea of elections and other things. And Zelensky saying, we're not going to accept any deal that you try to force upon us. So talk to us a little bit about that. Like, do we need Zelensky to end the deal? And part of this question is, if the US walks away, but then maybe Trump doesn't get the Nobel Peace Prize because he didn't solve it, but how long do you think the Ukrainians can keep fighting with European support? Would the Europeans sustain support? I know that was a lot of questions, but on the first one, I guess, do we need Zelensky? Or if we have a deal and we force it on them and they don't accept it, then what?
I mean, look, I think you are broadly correct in framing this choice as, if the Ukrainians and the Europeans come along or work with the US, then a deal is possible. If they don't, then it's a US walk away situation in this administration. I don't think playing hardball on the part of European capitals or even Kiev is going to work in convincing this administration to stay or keep the aid flowing. So then the question, as you put it, is, can European states on their own continue to support Ukraine? My understanding is that, in certain areas of armaments, probably yes. In funding, potentially yes, if they chose to. But, there's certain high-end systems that they can't provide. Maybe Trump would let them buy them from the US, right? Would be very expensive. But again, none of it resolves the underlying manpower and deficiencies in Ukraine. So, look, I think what Trump is doing right now with Zelensky is he's trying to push Zelensky to go to the table as well. And Trump, like I think I said at the start, is playing a very strong hand here, because if the Ukrainians don't come along with this, then they're going to have to sue for peace later on worse terms. And so, again, I don't particularly like that. I don't think it's a particularly, fruitful way to go about this. But I do think, folks who say that Trump needs Zelensky, he needs the Europeans, I think that's a misreading of the situation.
Stephen, what do you think?
Yeah, I worry that Trump has done harm to his own apparent effort to try to broker a peace settlement. And the kinds of things that he's saying about, putting pressure on Zelensky is one thing, but the kinds of things that he's saying are prone to backfire and diminish his own ability to persuade other parties to get on board, including the Europeans, including our own domestic public and Congress. So I fear that he's done harm, but has it been irreparable harm? Probably not yet. Trump can pivot. And if he doesn't keep up this kind of pressure and we move past it, there could be some benefit to making Zelensky, if he comes away with a reasonable deal, seem like he stood up to Trump. So it could, who knows, end up strengthening his own hand domestically in Ukraine. And at the end of the day, Emma is right. Ukraine does need the United States. So we'll have to see. My team here at Carnegie did a report that came out last year on strategic change in U.S. foreign policy. And one of the conclusions that we drew from reviewing a number of cases since 1945 was that actually persuasion really matters. There are a huge number of obstacles to making big changes. They are internal, the bureaucracy, Congress, the media environment, also external, allies, even non-allies. And this president is not very talented at persuading people. There's a way of framing what he's done that would be actually, what I'm doing is kind of in line with the goals that the Biden administration had, the main goals so far in this war in Ukraine. I may be going about it in a different way. Those are messages that I think would be valuable for the president, but clearly that's not his style of communication.
But I think also, Stephen, not to contradict you, but right, like you're thinking about how he would message that to, a liberal media elite that cares about foreign policy, right? Or maybe the average Democratic voter, right? I think he's instead messaging to the Republican base. And JD Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference fits into this, right? Europeans that don't share American values, right? And as a British American, I don't even know what I'm meant to do there. But the idea that he is sticking it to these effete European elites that can't even defend themselves. I mean, from his point of view, politically, that messaging does work. Even it's not going to be popular in Europe, goodness knows.
Just to throw in back to that question about, so, are we going to have to force something down the throat of Zelensky? And because if he says, hey, I'm not going to agree to this, I wasn't part of this, U.S., you and Russia sorted this out, and now you're trying to make me sign it, and I'm not going to do it. I think one of the things that could happen, too, is that Trump just turns around and says to Zelensky and to the Europeans, okay, I got you the ceasefire. Zelensky's not playing ball. So Zelensky, good luck to you. I'm walking back to Washington. I'm going to do some other things, and good luck. Essentially opening the door to Putin to come in and just really whack them with the implicit blessing of the United States, because we just walked away from it, and thereby having Putin force Zelensky to the table just through hard power. Europe trying to provide assistance, not being able to do it, and the Russians just turning on the tap, and then finally Trump turning to Zelensky and saying, "Did you have enough now? Okay, sign this." And I'm afraid that's also an option too.
But I don't know, would that be popular with Americans? I mean, really, if we walk away and there are images of Russia really making much more significant gains and really imposing their will on Ukraine in a different way, are those things that Americans are willing to accept?
Good question. I don't know. I would hate to test that theory, but that might be what he does.
It might
I
be.
don't know that that's good for Trump. I mean, I don't know if Americans would accept those images. To be honest, I don't know what Americans will accept and not accept right in this moment, but I have doubts that that would be something that would be good for Trump.
But would Trump care? Would Trump care if the Americans accepted it or not? He might not. He might not care. You'll say, "Look, I tried, guys. Don't throw rocks
Not on my watch," or well, that would be on his watch, but he'd blame backwards. But yeah, I don't have on Stephen.
If you look at where polling is right now, right? I mean, yes, images in the media of Russian advances, would probably have some impact. But if you look where polling is right now on further aid to Ukraine, if this is something where Trump can blame it on Zelensky,
right,
or blame it on the Europeans, again, I do not see the American public pushing back on that at all. I'm not even sure I see lawmakers doing that. In fact, I might go even further and I might say, if this looks like something that, Zelensky is sabotaging, I strongly suspect there's going to be various places in Europe where we're going to start to see pushback against policymakers. I mean, we're, expecting elections in Germany just this weekend, but right, there are, particularly in Western Europe, some of the polling suggests that the public is moving against this as well. So, again, I don't think this is a political risk for Trump in particular.
I'm not so sure about that. I think it would not be a good look for Americans, and a lot of Americans would not believe Trump's claims that Zelensky was the problem, et cetera. On the other hand, I think it's very plausible that Trump could reason the way we've been reasoning, that he could get away with this politically. Certainly, I don't know that he'd be wrong about that. And I think from his perspective, it's probably worse for him politically to be still aiding Ukraine by year 3 of his presidency than to do the total cutoff and see what happens and blame Biden and blame the Europeans and blame the Ukrainians if things get ugly.
Yeah.
Well, that's a pretty dark ending to our conversation.
Sorry.
I think we could have done this for another hour. That was really fantastic. There was obviously a lot there to discuss. We got to a lot of it, and I thought it was a really excellent discussion. So thank you, Emma, and thank you, Stephen, for joining us.
No, thanks for inviting us.
Thanks, enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was great to see you all.
Yeah.
All right, gang, are you all ready?